This week, we take a trip into the future with some of the smartest people in the world.
It's the annual gathering of global thinkers and doers, the TED Conference.
The home of the famous TED Talks, and we'll give you an inside look at what was going on.
Artificial intelligence, architecture, the dangers of the web.
Yep, and that's just for starters. This is Future Forward. I'm Steve Rosenbaum.
And I'm Gene DeRose. Let's go to TED.
And off we go. So, TED is hard to describe. It's like a really intense conversation times 400. And some of the pictures of the event I took, I'm going to share with our listeners on a link. And for our viewers, you'll be able to see them online. But this year was in some ways very different, and we're going to cover a lot of the themes. But I want to start, as we always do, with our famous loving and hating sequence. Gene, what are you loving this week?
I'm loving something that's been around for a few years, but has got some recent news, and it's called Airtable. Have you ever heard of it?
I have,
Steve. Okay, so Airtable is a wonderful part database, part spreadsheet, but what they've done that's I've considered pretty remarkable is they have created a bunch of easy to use, colorful, clear, crisp templates. They're clued into the visual value of presenting data and spreadsheet kind of data. And if you go to airtable.com or you download the iOS or Android apps, you'll quickly see, if you opt into these templates, that there's just great ways to sort of it's so user friendly that the kind of people that would say I would never go near a database find themselves using them. So it's a great product that remarkably, outside the Microsoft, Google, Apple Nexus, has been able to make a mark. But importantly, last week they raised $53 million, partly because they're going after an adjacent market that I'm just going to quickly read and then we'll move on. It's a new tool called Blocks, which they call a set of mix and match operations like SMS and integrating maps that users can just drop into their systems. Think of it as a way to give a small business owner a way to track all the performance across a network of operations. So they're making it practical and hands-on in real time too, which is a great idea. And that may sound like gobbledygook. Go look at Airtable. It's a beautiful thing, and I'm glad.
I'm a user and a fan. So you got you.
Yeah,
all right, and hating.
Yeah. So here's what I'm hating, and I've been on a few road trips lately, and I am infinitely frustrated at the failure for the car digital systems to talk effectively and make the handshake with your digital technology, whether it's getting caught between, am I connecting on Bluetooth or the USB wire, or I'm switching from radio to my Spotify to my Pandora to my GPS. It's very frustrating, and it should be so simple and basic. And as usual, it's because users are taking third place behind whatever set of people are competing with each other to own you. So that sucks.
I'm sorry you're having bad road trips, but I had a good road trip. So we can talk about that.
And what was the what was the feel? And we want to remind people that Steve is a TED fellow. Is that the right term?
TED resident.
A TED resident. I'm sorry.
The fellows are a different program, and they're both great programs.
Right.
So the feeling this year was different. One of the things I've come to believe about TED is, to some extent, you get out of it what you bring to it. So I've always said, to some extent, TED, you take away from TED what you bring to it. So if you bring optimism and curiosity, you come away with new ideas. If you bring cynicism, you can come away thinking the world's coming to an end. This year was fairly bipolar, I would say. There was some very serious, difficult conversations about issues, and then some kind of unbridled optimism.
Yeah. And I guess we'll get to it, but it seems like the backdrop of the in parallel Zuckerberg testimony on the Hill probably painted things a certain
You
color.
know, it's funny. Like most conferences, when you're in it, I mean, people glanced at the Zuckerberg stuff, but there wasn't. I mean, it wasn't the talk of the convention.
Yeah. Well, one of the articles that we looked at seemed to indicate that just about everyone speaking took at least an indirect swipe at Facebook. But maybe that was
Yeah,
projected.
no, I that was not my take. I mean, look, a lot of what makes TED interesting is they get out of the day to day and they talk about big, complicated. They talk about Mars and they talk about there was a fantastic talk about combating global climate change by importing cold from outer space, which I didn't really understand. But let's start. So day one, they hit hard with like 3 issues right up front. They did the Me Too movement. They did the school shooting stuff, and then almost immediately they jumped into Jaron Lanier, who some of our listeners will know and some will not. He's a very early innovator in the web and specifically in VR, and he gave a profoundly disturbing talk.
Yeah, he's a thinker. We used to have him at some of my Jupiter conferences back in the day, and he has a real articulate ability to take things to another level. And so, people should make sure to take a look at that talk that we provide a link to.
You know what? Let's just play a moment of his talk. We'll just play a little bit of the audio, and then we can talk about it. So here's a little bit, and then this is one of the talks that was published.
Back in the 1980s, actually, I gave my first talk at TED, and I brought some of the very, very first public demonstrations of virtual reality ever to the TED stage. And at that time, we knew that we were facing a knife-edge future where the technology we needed, the technology we loved, could also be our undoing. We knew that if we thought of our technology as a means to ever more power, if it was just a power trip, we'd eventually destroy ourselves. That's what happens when you're on a power trip and nothing else. So the idealism of digital culture back then was all about starting with that recognition of the possible darkness and trying to imagine a way to transcend it with beauty and creativity. I always used to end my early TED Talks with a rather horrifying line, which is, we have a challenge. We have to create a culture around technology that is so beautiful, so meaningful, so deep, so endlessly creative, so filled with infinite potential that it draws us away from committing mass suicide.
So that's really that was the gist of his talk, was essentially that the web we've built is not working.
Yeah. And its point is that it's run away from us. It's a matter of control. Like what I find it problematic sometimes that would be kind of freedom lovers or socialists or whatever, when you put it in the hands of the inmates, you get what you deserve, but the opposite is clamping down and putting more controls. Like, what does he understand to be the solution? Is it over commercialized?
Well, here's the quote that got picked up and taken away, and it summarizes his talk. And I'm going to read it. He said, "We cannot have a society in which If two people wish to communicate, the only way that that can happen is if it's financed by a third person who wishes to manipulate them.
Yeah, to me that says, well, in a way it leads to advertising.
Well, it essentially says you and I should be able to have a conversation without somebody trying to sell us something in between it. And
That's right.
You know, it landed hard in the room because you're hard pressed to disagree with that, right? You know.
Yeah, and actually I would say that is directly related to Facebook, but in a very metaphysical, historical sense, not the hearings this week, because our world is dominated by a place where we share, but it's intermediated by what advertisers might want us to do or see.
You know, and you know, so hanging around that conversation was the question. Well, maybe the answer is Facebook should have a paid service where you know, you pay a certain amount every month and you can communicate with people. But from an investor standpoint, there's no upside in that business. That makes them the ultimate dumb pipe.
Yeah, it just doesn't make sense. And it's ironic, you know, some of us smirk sometimes at people that will use email or text messaging or other direct, unmediated ways to communicate, share things, but instead of doing things that are in the cloud. But, you know, you understand it up to a point. And honestly, I've been saying this even here a few times, but it's gotten in the way of everything. A search is not a search anymore. You know, you get answers and things that, you know, are not as direct as you wish because they're going to try to prod you somewhere.
So then, after a brief musical interlude, they brought on Steve Pinker.
A great thinker, to not be a bad rhyme.
And his take, I mean, you know, he and Jaron could not be more polar opposites. He essentially says, and makes an argument in his new book backed up with data, that if you look at anything objectively in terms of, you know, over a time span, that things are just getting better. We're living longer. People are more wealthy. People are happier. People are, have, all, there's by a whole, and I haven't read the book. I have it. And it was a great big smiley face with an asterisk. And the asterisk was the media, which he holds almost entirely responsible for amplifying little blips of bad news and making them seem like they're somehow bigger than they were 5 years ago.
Which I find accurate but unavoidable, right? In the same way that I feel like Facebook and Trump are not so much themselves, they're things we created ourselves. You know, it's not, you know, we should have a better media, but it's hard to decide outside of legislating that media should operate by certain rules what it is we should do about it.
Now, having said that, part of what makes, TED is a room of open-minded people. It's probably more left of center than it is right, but there's a fairly large contingent of people that describe themselves as libertarians.
Of course.
And so for the libertarian piece of the TED crowd, the Pinker talk went over very well. Like, all you nervous Nellies, chill out, everyth's better.
Which, if we reduced it to internet, is an open, decentralized, ruleless internet. Has nothing wrong with that because of all the good that's being done, as well as as caveat emptor on everything else. But some of it addressed. But where does sort of happiness kind of lay in all that? Wasn't that part of the or is that the another talk that you?
No. There was a significant amount of discussion of why, if we have all of these privileges and better healthcare and living longer, why we're not happier. It was and then just kind of to wrap up the tech summary of the TED Week, one of the things that I do, I'm on what's called a TED host. So I work with the speakers. There's one speaker assigned to me, and I'm there to kind of get him comfortable in the room and make sure he knows people and or she. And in this case, I was assigned to a guy named James Brindle, and he wasn't speaking till Friday, and I met him Tuesday morning, and I said to him, "So, is your talk going to be really bleak?" And he looked at me and he said, "As a matter of fact, yes." And I thought, no, because I knew I'd researched him, and I thought, no, it won't. But in fact, it was maybe it was a little bit of a sidebar, and I'll tell you about it. But it was pretty damn bleak, I gotta say.
Right. And he's the one. This is the one that kind of hedged on happiness, to say the least.
It was mostly about YouTube, children in YouTube. And,
right.
I think of myself as being pretty well schooled on YouTube and what's going on there. But he showed trends in what particularly young children are watching on YouTube that was so jaw-droppingly disturbing. Just hundreds of millions of views of either meaningless nonsense or worse. Like,
right.
And his point was that the algorithm can't tell the difference between people in rabbit costumes jumping around on the screen and people in Hitler costumes jumping around on the screen.
Right. And one of the articles references this sort of, you type in how to, and it starts to suggest autofilling, have better sex or something like that in a generic way, which to me circles back to the thing we talked about at the outset, which is, why does that need to be mediated? Let me finish writing my how-to, because if I'm a child, it's going to be win at Minecraft or whatever.
So why does why does autofill, what does it gain? I mean, I guess it gets you to the click faster.
Yes. It gets you to the click faster, and instead of assuming you might be an outlier or you're just yourself, it's playing a percentages game, because maybe that's the thing that is most frequently, typed after how to, which is fine, but who cares?
Well, particularly because Google doesn't know whether how to is being typed by anyway.
That's right.
So the Brindle talk is not yet. The thing is, TED literally is hundreds of talks in a 5-day period. Right. And then they parse them out over the course of the year. Some will come out very quickly because they're topical and timely. Some will come out 6 months from now. I can't tell you when the Brindle talk will come out, but I can tell you that there will be an earthquake among 3 to 5 year old parents of 3 to 5 year olds shocked at what their children are watching. Like bleak is the only word to use for it.
Yeah, well, and arguably, and this is where, again, I don't want to keep hearkening back to Facebook, but it upsets me, the disingenuousness of everything's fine until I'm caught or something, because clearly, if you look at the history of YouTube, they've done a few things the last few years to try to start a different place where kids might be, because they know there are issues around this, but all those have fallen flat. I'm not sure how Red is doing, or the paid for YouTube, but I don't believe very well, because nobody has a reason to do it compared to free YouTube. But, in some ways, YouTube's gotten away with a lot. It doesn't have the kind of 13 and under or registered universe that a place like Facebook has.
Right.
And so
exactly right.
I can attest that with my son, he increasingly wants to just spend time on YouTube, and I have to control and monitor that. I mean, it's very hard to do without looking over his shoulder.
Well, and yeah, I mean, those were the kind of the big, overarching issues that hung over the conference. But then there was also, and that's part of what makes TED so great, like there were 2 talks that both I can only describe as being about beauty.
Well, that's cool.
So Renzo Piano, the architect, who I'd never seen speak before, was absolutely spectacular, just delightful. And he also, had some, so, I mean, the quote that there were that I took away was he said, better cities make better citizens. And, he really cared a lot about architecture and beauty, and they showed a lot of his buildings, and I frankly did not know kind of the global footprint that he's had. Extraordinary, beautiful, beautiful work.
It's amazing. And do you feel that is there a first world, third world issue that he avoids? Is he talking about does he bring in as much that needs to be brought in terms of for whom we're talking about this makes a better world, or does that not necessarily be part of the dialogue?
No, I think he floats above that. I mean, so the other quote that I wrote down was, he said, "I think we have a duty to build environments that are beautiful. Anything else is kind of grand scale vandalism."
Sure. Well, that makes sense.
And part of what's wonderful about TED is, where else are you going to see, I'm not an architect. I'm not going to architecture conferences. Where else am I going to get to hear him talk about his work in this very kind of, I was going to say modest, but that's not the word I mean exactly, intimate way.
Right.
So then the other beauty talk, as it was a bridge builder named Ian Firth. And, sometimes at TED things get so high level that you just get overwhelmed with the complexity of the world or of, global warming. And so to bring it down, he brought it down to this very tangible thing about beauty and bridges, and the beauty and how bridges, when they're carefully made and beautifully designed and structurally brilliant, are really works of art. And I ended up meeting him afterwards. We talked for a few minutes after his speech, and just a delightful human being.
Yeah. Well, those are good things to have in, what is ostensibly but never really a technology event. And I'm glad to hear that. Was there a lot of dialogue? Was that a?
Well, I mean, there were some pointed comments about why it is the U.S. seems to be the leader in ugly bridges. And then
we have more, so we probably have more ugly ones. But
he
understand.
did briefly talk about the Florida bridge collapse. I mean, he had to include it, but it really wasn't what the talk was about.
Right.
But in both cases, in the Renzo talk and then the Ian Firth talk, it came down to this complicated connection between safety and architecture and structural integrity and beauty.
And I would guess form and function, which historically is the mix. And with something like bridges, they almost become the same thing.
Yes. I realized we got caught up in talking, and I didn't show you the James Brindle video that I found, but that's okay. Well,
we'll make sure that there's a link, because it is a really. I looked at it. It's worth seeing, and he's very articulate.
Then we kind of found ourselves talking about democracy. And, again, part of what you do is you knit together a couple of talks in your head to try and see if you find a theme.
Right.
And there was one talk, I don't know if I agreed with it, to be honest, but I certainly found it interesting, which had to do with whether or not it's going to be possible to use technology to automate democracy, and whether or not AI in particular could essentially provide something that looks more like the phrase that came up a lot was direct democracy.
Technically, yes. I mean, it may be mundane, but there are certain things that, voting itself would be more efficient and transparent. I think underneath the back of it, the haves and have-nots is going to increasingly be the issue. I don't know how much they talk about that, but the danger is the nature of the dialogue that digital technology. Oddly enough, for a cold, rational, technology-based platform, it empowers emotions over logic when it comes to the world of persuasion, which means eloquent bad people can get a lot done.
Yeah, but which does bring us almost inevitably to Kurzweil. So tell me what about Ray you found particularly interesting?
Well, yeah. So not having been there, I've always been a kind of a mixed fan of Ray Kurzweil. For those of you who don't know, he's futurist with real cred behind him. Now, I believe, works for Google. And what he's done that is a kind of works well with the times is he's very good at making reductive, this is going to happen in 25 years kinds of predictions, which, are easy to say and make great headlines. We're going to include some links both to references of what he did, because as Steve indicated, his talk is not currently available. But an old friend of mine, Jack Hittery, very, very well-known and successful entrepreneur, posted on Facebook. So I'm going to take the liberty of reading a few lines, because with Ray Kurzweil again, it's very simple declarative predictions. And so speaking on AI life extension and things like that, he kind of spoke about a few different things as I understand it. And this is the wave of things he's been speaking about lately. He made a kind of a companion speech at South by Southwest a few weeks ago, which we're also providing links to. And so he's focused on, he has been the one person who's almost been the leader around the singularity, and when we're approaching the age when computer and digital technology approaches and or passes the capacity of humans to think. And I think where a split has started to come, or an acknowledgement, is that even if we reach that point, Ray predicts AI passing the Turing test by 2029, there's a difference between sheer logic and the ability to do calculations and that kind of thinking, and what's now being called, sentience, which is a little bit more of an emotional powered and more kind of rich 3D intelligence. But some of the things that he talked about are that we're about to enter a period of what he calls longevity escape velocity, i.e. a period in which we can add more time to our lives than time that is passing. And he talked about these things being in the next 15 years or so. He also made some announcements that were very Google-centric about being able to have conversations, deeper versions of search that can query books, and a deeper wealth of knowledge. So it's hard to really pull at that stuff, but maybe you should respond more directly to why Ray kind of bugs you a little bit sometimes.
So I saw his film in 2009, and I was at a screening that he was at and spoke at afterwards. And the film in 2009, which is a long time ago, was compelling. But I guess I feel like, I don't know. I can't decide if I think he's a scientist or a
huckster.
Showman was going to be mine, but yeah. So if I said to you, Gene, I'm willing to guarantee you that in 20 years, we will have LEDs in our head that will replace, I could make up a story and it would be compelling, because in 15 years, nobody's going to check back and go, wait, 15 years ago, you said, he predicts things so far ahead that it's as good a guess as any other. And I mean, yes, computers and humans are increasingly doing things, or computers are doing, I don't know. I guess I just think 10 years after the movie The Singularity, it seems less innovative and a little bit more predictable. I did not go to his talk. but I felt like I didn't feel like there was going to be anything new.
Right. And look, the thing about somebody like him, it reminds me of something that Mary Meeker once said about my company Jupiter's online advertising predictions in the late 90s. You know, that we were directionally correct, which is a kind of a pot shot at the specifics.
Right.
And I believe there's value in that, in the sense that to the greater world, even articulating that something might be on the table having to do with, you know, the future of how economics and our bank accounts might work, or that approaching longevity, apparently Ray used to take 200 pills a day and is now down to 100, you know, because he's preparing for this time. But I do believe, and this is where the kind of the writer in me appreciates, some people provide a value by articulating things that, you know, those that are sophisticated know about, but it incites the imagination a little bit, and sometimes that's what's important.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the other thing is you really, it's physically impossible to go to every talk at TED. Your head will explode. So, you know, at some point you know, people take a break, they walk around, they go outside, they watch the in the simulcast lounges. But and
well, the one thing I would say, and we may not get a chance otherwise, is there's something really important that TED did about, depending on how you define it, 8 or 10 years ago, which is it went from being the most narrow, exclusive, you know, winnowing kind of thing in the world, that you could barely get access to. They cracked the code on maintaining the beauty of that and fully democratizing it, which is to say the TEDx amounted to a kind of a freeware version existing anywhere it needed to around the world. And most importantly, I believe the best video site on the internet is the TED Talks, because they do such a great job at pushing those out the door, at sharing them. There are thousands and thousands of great events in the world that have never figured out how to, you know, expand and leverage the content and the dialogue that's created. And the TED Talks are an evolving treasure of the world of imagination and you know, and knowledge.
So it's interesting. One of the things I came away from TED thinking is, TED, when you're there, is two things. It's the talks, and then it's the conversations after the talks. And online, I'm not sure you get the same experience.
Not even close.
And you know, that's a solvable problem. So that's, you know, that has me scratching my head a little bit.
Or it's not. I mean, I don't know. One thing, as a person who used to produce conferences, that we always thought was, you're never going to be able to replace the value of the offline and the between the lines part of these events, which is people pressing flesh together.
I'm thinking more just about a way to facilitate conversations around video, but it's that is a longer conversation. So yeah. Because we're going to run out of time, I want to tell you about one. I was going to call it a fun talk, but I don't really mean fun. It was a young man. His name is Alex. I always mispronounce his name. Honnold. He's a rock climber, and he well, here I've got the video pulled up. This is him doing a free solo of one of the largest walls in North America. He talked about free climbing. I don't know if you know that phrase. This is like no ropes,
no ropes, no attachments.
But he talked about it with such sophistication and complexity. Like, I mean, my first reaction was, he's just out of his fucking mind. But he talked about how he prepared to climb the face, and how he literally rehearsed it for a year with ropes, so that his hand knew every crevice and every hold. And it was still flipping terrifying to watch. It made my stomach hurt. I mean, he was on stage, so he wasn't dead. If he had died, he wouldn't.
Exactly.
Right? But nonetheless, it was still absolutely terrifying.
And how do you, like, what's the role or what's the why of something like that is at TED? Because we could go back historically and there's always some wonderful things like that. It's just a blistering example of humanity doing amazing things. Is it as simple as that?
No, it was more internal than that. It was about extreme preparation and about overcoming internal obstacles and about taking control of fear. And but it wasn't, he was brave, but he wasn't cavalier.
Right. So this is symptomatic of the era we're in right now, where the value of being present and being, mindful and having intent around what you're doing is, this is our new religion.
And with that, our journey to TED has ended because we're out of time. But we will share via the site, via Future Forward blog or podcast.com, links to the TED Talks as they come up, and we'll have some of them ones we have on the site today, and we will be back next week with another journey into the future.
And Steve will be well rested because he worked his ass off this week, and I know you just got back a few minutes ago, pretty much. So a really, really good week, and we'll talk to everybody next week.
See you next week.
Bye.